Hello and welcome to Sarastro's Painting. In this video I'll be painting 3 different Trooper units from Star Wars Shatterpoint, each with its own ambience, to hopefully show how much fun painting white can actually be. Let's jump in and create a gradient for our first Trooper miniature, Commander Cody, who I imagine standing in the warm-toned environment of Geonosis. If you'd like to have a concrete starting point when working with white, I'd suggest beginning with a simple grayscale gradient. So here I've chosen ProAcryl's Warm Grey and Bright Warm Grey to establish the initial levels for the shadows and highlights respectively. I've placed these a fair distance apart on the palette, and I'm now mixing an intermediate mid-tone. By going no lighter than Bright Warm Grey for now, we avoid the mistake of going too bright too soon with our highlights. I'm now going to add some colour to match the look of Cody's armour as he appears in the movies. So for the shadow tones, I'm going to mix in some black brown along with some dark golden brown. For the midtones, I'm adding some warm flesh, and for the highlights, I'm going to mix in some ivory. So here I'm mixing the black brown and dark golden brown into the warm grey to create my shadow tone. I'm now mixing the warm flesh into the mid-tone, and some ivory into the bright warm grey for my highlights. I'm then creating some more intermediate tones. Achieving a pleasing gradient like this that captures the ambience we're after is actually half the battle. Now we paint. I'm beginning by blocking in my main areas of shadow on the legs, followed by the midtones and highlights. You can see that I primed the figure in black, followed by some zenithal highlights, which does a nice job of indicating where we might expect the shadows to fall. I'm not after a particularly smooth look here, and I'm working in quite a free and sketchy style, bearing in mind that I'll be adding plenty of weathering and battle damage later on. I prefer blocking in the main tone straight away rather than slowly building up layers of highlights, which could be quite laborious. But it's entirely up to you how you want to actually create your desired level of contrast. It might seem like we're working with too much colour for what is supposed to be white armour, but it's worth remembering that white is somewhat unique in its ability to reflect all wavelengths or colours of the visible spectrum. This makes it particularly susceptible to reflecting colours from nearby objects or the environment. I might actually suggest painting the base before the figure to help judge the overall levels and effectiveness of the ambience. The main reason I haven't is simply because I'm waiting for some basing materials to arrive. Once the initial values are in place, we can begin refining things. Notice, although the top end of our gradient is quite far from pure white, it still looks pretty bright. You can see I've also added some black lining for the belt. For these coloured markings, I'm starting with some orange mixed with a little of the black brown. After some further refining and neatening up, I'm using some bright ivory to add the brightest glints. And I'm now adding plenty of weathering and battle damage. Focusing this along some of these edges can look quite effective. For the basing, I chose to add some additional bits of rock formation from Epic Basing. and I'm now using Vallejo's Brown Earth basing paste to add some texture to the ground, followed with some additional bits of cork and grit. Once dry, I'm using Scalecolor's brown leather, orange leather, and Iroko to bring things together. And here I'm just adding a little extra brown cast into some of the shadows. And this completes Commander Cody, and shows one approach to creating a nice warm ambience when working with white. Next, let's try a forest-style ambience for the Advanced Recon Force Trooper. And once again starting with a gradient using warm grey to bright warm grey, and this time I'm adding some black-brown to the shadows, a hint of purple in the midtones, and a little faded green in the highlights. So here I'm mixing my shadow, mid and highlight tones to form my gradient. And once again starting with the legs and working my way up. I'm painting over the gaps in the belt for now, and will add some fine dark lining in a while. Working with the paint more thinned can help with some of the broader gradients. I might also apply the paint more like a wash for the more textured areas like the face mask here. Once again, things won't really make sense visually until we've painted the base. You can see I'm less concerned with smoothness than I am with creating a pleasing sense of volume and ambience. I also added some bright ivory for the brightest highlights. I'm now adding some dark earth basing paste to the ground, along with various forest-themed basing pieces, once again by Epic Basing. You can see I've already painted the larger terrain element, and before painting the rest, I'm going to brush on some black primer by Mr. Hobby, thinned with their Hobby Colour thinner. I'm now using various greens and browns to paint the base up. And I decided to add 1 or 2 small tufts of grass from Gamer's Grass. After a few final touches of weathering, the Trooper is complete. And here we can see what a subtle yet striking difference in ambience we've managed to achieve with our handling of the white. Finally, I'm going to paint my first Stormtrooper from the Darth Vader squad pack, and I've chosen to use only those bases that capture the look of a space station. I used the airbrush to quickly provide the colour for the bases by priming in black. I then applied a mix of black and sombre grey from a bit of an angle to create the slightly cool purplish tone. I decided to switch to the Scalecolor Smooth Artist paints for the Stormtroopers and created my initial grayscale simply with a mix of black and white. I'm then adding some Cobalt Violet Grey to create a purplish tone for the shadows to midtones. And I played with adding a little Pastel Green and some Vanilla White for the lighter midtones and highlights respectively. So here I'm creating my purplish shadow tones. And I'm now transitioning into a hint of green, followed with some Vanilla White for the highlights. I'm working with a little more care for the Stormtroopers as I'm after a cleaner look. And if you're curious, I painted this mostly in a single session, lasting around 3 hours. You can see I chose to paint the trooper off the base. This is simply to avoid my making a mess of the battle station floor. And once again applying the paint more like a wash to more easily shade some of the recesses in the more textured areas. It's a good idea to stick to reasonably thinned layers if you're after a smooth finish. I also want to add some nice crisp dark lining. I'm now adding various reflective glints with my brightest tone quite freely, as I imagine there might be various lights within the environment allowing for multiple reflections. After providing a few edge highlights to the base, I'll be applying a layer of matte varnish before gluing the Stormtrooper down. And with the Stormtrooper complete, we can see an even more striking contrast against the warmer tones of the previous two troopers. Thank you so much for joining me. I do hope the video has given you some useful ideas for the next time you paint white. As always, you can find full paint and product lists in the video description, along with links to all of the places I can be found on social media, as well as the various music platforms. My sincerest thanks go to my amazing patrons for funding this work. If you'd like to support what I do, feel free to hit the Patreon link and pledge what you can. Join me again soon, and happy painting!